My name is Amanda Brissett. I'm General Manager of the Western Sydney Business Connection, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar presented in partnership with the Westmead Institute of Medical Research. Firstly, I'd just like to say I hope that you are all hanging in there during this difficult time. Before we commence, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are meeting on today, wherever that may be for you. I'm on the land of the Darug and the Guringai people. I acknowledge them as the traditional owners of the land on which I reside, and I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people that we have online today. Well, as we brace ourselves for another 4 weeks in lockdown, the Western Sydney community more than ever now wants to understand our path to recovery. What's our way out of this? How long is this going to go on for, even after the 4 weeks? So our focus this afternoon is, of course, on COVID. We'll share an update today on the latest developments in relation to COVID from both a national and global perspective. It's a movable feast, and us lay people are obviously struggling to keep up with the changes, with things to, the restrictions, the Delta variant. I mean, there's just so much for us to take in. So today you'll be hearing from arguably Australia's most experienced and preeminent medical researchers. Westmead Institute of Medical Research works tirelessly to unearth groundbreaking and innovative research insights to bring about better diagnostics, treatment and cures, improving health outcomes for current and future generations. WIMR is a multidisciplinary research institute with many of the researchers also active in practicing clinicians, and they share their time across both the research institute and in the hospitals and in their clinics. So what they're seeing every day in their day-to-day work, they're able to work on in the research in the lab. So really making sure that the research, I guess, is as applicable and as applied as possible. The Westmead Institute of Medical Research then, because of this, are very well placed to investigate COVID, and are doing some really interesting research now on the impacts of the vaccine. So before we get underway, I'd like to give you a little bit of further information on Professor Cunningham and Palmer, who are presenting today's webinar. Now, these bios are a little bit longer than our normal bios because they are such accomplished people that have done so much to contribute to our community and to health. So Professor Tony Cunningham is the founder of Westmead Institute of Medical Research. He is an infectious diseases physician, clinical virologist and scientist, internationally renowned for his research related to HIV and the herpes virus. He is an antivirals expert. Professor Cunningham and his team pioneered the Shingrix vaccine in a quest to prevent shingles in ageing populations. This is currently being manufactured by GSK and will be available in June, which is an incredible achievement. Congratulations on that, Professor Cunningham. He is also the co-director of the Centre for Virus Research at WIMR, director of the Australian Centre for HIV and Hepatitis Virology Research, and serves on numerous international expert panels on HIV, antivirals and vaccines. Tony originally founded Westmead Institute of Medical Research in 2010 and was awarded Officer of the Order of Australia for service to medicine, particularly in the field of viral research and through the development of leadership of medical and biomedical research. Professor Sarah Palmer is the co-director of the Centre for Virus Research at the Westmead Institute of Medical Research and a professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Health with the University of Sydney's School of Medicine. She is a world-renowned HIV researcher who received her PhD at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, focusing on medical virology. Professor Palmer also conducted a postdoctoral studies at Stanford University's Centre for AIDS and Research. For 8 years, Professor Palmer directed the core virology laboratory for the HIV drug resistance program at the National Institute of Health in the USA. Her expertise in identifying parts of HIV proteins likely to stimulate human white cell responses has now been applied to this COVID-19 project. We feel really honoured to have you both here with us today, and I extend a very warm welcome to you both.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks, Amanda.
Okay, well, let's kick it off. So the first question that we have for you this afternoon is, how long do you think the Greater Sydney's current lockdown is going to last? What happens after 4 weeks?
Do you want me to start
That's
off?
you, Tony. Yeah, that's your question.
Okay. Look, today I think it's 170. Yesterday was 239, but they're not the important figures. The important ones are the ones in the community, and it's different to last time. We keep saying Delta is different. This is a different outbreak. And last year, we would have seen virtually zero cases out in the community. And now we're seeing about a third to a half of those cases still in the community. And it's certainly true that, as we've seen with the big family outbreaks, often associated with very good reasons for families to get together, you have one person infected, the whole 18 people in that gathering is infected. There are issues of communication there. I think, as Chris Bowen said on Q&A last night, very clearly, that we need to make sure that our messages linguistically and culturally are very accurate. If you have cousins, etc., in houses next to each other, then it needs to be made clear that it's households, not families, that you're talking about in terms of restrictions. So I think the success of getting those messages across is incredibly important. Vaccines are critically important, but we have to remember that with Delta, one shot is not quite enough, although it will start to have impact within 3 weeks. But full immunization is required, and that may take anywhere from 3 weeks for Pfizer to 4 to 6 weeks for now the new recommendations for AstraZeneca. So the success is all going to be around whether we can get the message across to people all over Greater Sydney, and that is to abide by the public health directions as not just lockdown, it's wearing of masks, and it really applies to the whole of Greater Sydney. It'll take a crystal ball to determine how long this is going to take. And I'm certainly not going to make that prediction, but I would be prepared for an extension beyond 4 weeks.
Based on what we've seen so far, I mean, knowing that we've had 100 infectious in the community just over the last 2 days, 4 weeks does seem a little optimistic, but let's hope that, as you say, the messaging is getting out there and people continue to do the right thing and we get through it as quickly as possible. So in your opinion, how long will Australia need to live with lockdowns in general? So once we are at that point where we do have, you know, what's referred to as herd immunity, and we're sort of starting to come out the other side, will lockdowns continue to be part of our day-to-day?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I think the way to handle this is really that the message can be quite confusing. So you have to think about the effect of vaccines as a hierarchy, and vaccines are, in essence, we're going to rely upon vaccines, as we have for measles and for every other type of infectious disease. You have to remember that measles is more infectious than this virus. It's a question of one person will infect an average of 18 rather than one person infecting an average of 6. And we've managed to get over 95% of the population immunized against measles, and we only see minor outbreaks from time to time. So we've got extremely good vaccines against measles. We're not so successful against flu. Our vaccines aren't as good. We've got a very good vaccines against COVID. So when we're looking at the effects of vaccines, the pinnacle is to prevent death and severe disease, admission to ICU. That's what the vaccines were directed towards. Then we come down to the prevention of all disease. And I've tried to make the distinction in the press between severe disease being a lung and systemic disease, and the mild disease and spread being principally up in the upper respiratory tract. And we know these coronaviruses, other coronaviruses, can cause the common cold. So you do get a hierarchy of effects. You get most effect against severe disease and death, which is upwards of 97%. with 2 doses of the vaccine for even the Delta strain. Then it comes down a bit more towards 88 to 90% with 2 vaccines, Pfizer in particular, against all disease. And I should have said both vaccines will give you that protection against severe disease and death. And then it comes down still to prevention against spread and infection. So we're relying on these vaccines to prevent as much spread as we can and to protect the population against disease. And the current estimates are about 80%, and the discussions that we've had amongst pretty expert vaccinologists is that we probably will not be able to prevent some minor spread of these coronaviruses in the future. The important thing is to be able to protect the vulnerable, not just the aging, but those who are immunosuppressed. And we certainly need to aim at upwards of 80% of the population being immunized. And that may include 12 years and up, the way things are going at present. It is encouraging to hear that 85% of people in the Greater Sydney region in latest surveys are interested in getting the vaccines. If that's the case, then it's all a matter of supply for the rest of the year.
And so just to recap there, so once, in your opinion, and obviously we know that that it's your opinion, once we get to 80%, we will be at a point where lockdowns will not be a part of our future.
I think we're going to learn from our colleagues overseas in the UK and the USA, and particularly the UK, because of its very high levels of immunization using both Pfizer and AstraZeneca, which is analogous to our situation here. And so that 80% is a figure that everybody is currently pinpointing. All the expertise is pinpointing. Whether that proves to be exactly correct will become clear, I think, over the next 6 months.
We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and there are 2 here, particularly about the Delta virus. So I might start with one and then lead straight into the other. So the first question is, what are the specific characteristics of the Delta variant we are seeing in the Sydney outbreak? And I guess a follow-up question to that is, we've heard three shots of the vaccine can stop Delta. Is that true? So
I can start with the variant. So the Delta variant is what is causing the spread of infections currently in Sydney. And this Delta variant was first identified in India. And it was identified in India in May, when India had a very catastrophic spike in infections. And the infections in India went up to as many as 400,000 per day. And what we know and what reports have shown about this Delta variant is that it is 60% more infectious than the original COVID strain that was identified in Wuhan. And furthermore, when people are infected with the Delta variant, they shed 1,000 times more virus or viral particles than the original strain of COVID-19 that was identified in Wuhan. So that means that this Delta variant is extremely contagious. And as Tony said, when you go inside and you are shedding 1,000 particles from an infection, that makes it very easy to infect others inside and your family members. Furthermore, the other interesting aspect about the Delta variant is that a lot of times people are shedding virus 2 days after they are infected. And this might be before they even know they are infected or experiencing symptoms. So that's why it's so contagious and so easy to spread this virus, in that sometimes you could be infected and shedding virus and not even know that you're shedding this virus, and you could be shedding very high levels of the virus.
So taking up the second point about a third booster, well, there's a lot of discussion about that at present, and this is something Sarah and I are particularly interested in. We're looking at the duration of natural immunity. We're looking at the duration of immunity after the Pfizer vaccine, and we're looking at the duration of immunity after novel experimental vaccines at WIMR at present. And there are two arms to the immune response. One is antibodies and one is white cells. And we know that with other coronaviruses, white cells last longer, even though the antibodies target that spike. And they are the really important active principle. But the duration of immunity may be determined, and probably is determined, by the white cells. So both may play off together. So there's a lot of debate at present about when boosters should be given, and also what type of boosters. And I wouldn't mind betting that we will have boosters next year, and that we will have boosters against the Delta variant. It's taken over the world. It's virtually crowded out the Beta variant in South Africa, so Delta is more than 95% of infections. Almost all of the problems with ICU in the UK are in unvaccinated people, and the same is true in Australia. All those 56 people in ICU are unvaccinated or have had an early one shot. There's no one there who's had two shots and has had enough time to develop immunity.
And
so
if I could,
two shots are really good. That's what's recommended at present, and we don't yet have a recommendation for boosters, but that'll probably be needed to perpetuate immunity, and I wouldn't mind betting that's happening next year.
And I would like to back up what Tony was saying. In the United States, 97% of people who are hospitalized with COVID infections are unvaccinated. And in recent deaths attributed to COVID infections in the United States, 99% of them are in people who are unvaccinated. So really, vaccination does prevent severe illness and in many cases death. Yeah, so I would, and also in the United States, they are indicating that they may require boosters in people who are over the age of 65, possibly when they go into the winter in the United States. So this is something that's being discussed with infectious disease experts in the United States, thinking that possibly those who are over 65 may require a booster going into winter.
The current recommendation is 2 doses, and it's doing very, very well. And given the problem we have with supply in Australia, it would be really very unwise for anyone to start thinking about a 3rd shot while we haven't got enough 2 shots into everyone.
Absolutely. I would agree with Tony. We need the 2 shots in every arm first, and then we can contemplate whether we need boosters.
I do have a question here about shedding the virus, but I just really wanted to make a comment. I mean, the COVID hit us really quickly, and the Delta strain has moved through very quickly. And hats off to the scientific and research community with how quickly you've responded, and how quickly the vaccines have assisted us in getting to at least giving us some hope towards getting back to some sort of normalcy. So the quick question here about, maybe not be quick, from Suzanne: can you explain more about shedding of the virus? What does that mean? Can you explain in layman's terms what that means?
Sarah, do you want to do that?
Yeah, I can start. So shedding of the virus is when you become infected, and then you start shedding particles of the virus that can be infectious to others. That's what we mean by shedding of the virus. So with the Delta strain, what we're seeing is these viral particles are 1,000 times higher in the upper respiratory region of someone who's infected with the Delta variant. So that means that they can shed these particles and infect others much easier. So we say you're shedding virus, that means you're essentially shedding infectious viral particles that could go on to infect someone else. And that's why this Delta variant is so very, very difficult to contain and combat, because people who are infected with it have very high levels of shedding these particles that can then go on to infect others. Do you want to comment on that, Tony?
I totally agree, but I just wanted to add two things. You can shed in two ways: as large droplets, which we thought was the sole way you could get infected in the early days of the epidemic, and as aerosols. And I'm sure you've all seen those rather concerning pictures of one person opening their door in quarantine and another person opening their door, and the waves of smoke that people use to test this going from one door to the other. So those are the aerosols of virus that are actually spreading locally indoors and with family mixing. And so this is a particularly infectious strain. We didn't see this so much with the Wuhan strain, but with Delta, it's even more imperative to wear those masks indoors and to avoid family mixing.
Absolutely. By wearing those masks, you're preventing those droplets of virus exposed, going from your airspace to someone else's airspace.
And just to follow up, this is from the same participant asking, just a follow-on question: how long does it live on surfaces?
Tony, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, no, it's been tested in the early days, not with Delta, but with the earlier strains, and it can, on wet surfaces, it can last about 24 hours, and perhaps a little longer, and it varies depending on the quality of the surface, whether you're looking at stainless steel or whatever. Surfaces are not important. Everybody has overemphasized cleaning. What is really important is the droplet and aerosol spread, and we become much more aware of aerosol spread at present. So I'm not saying don't clean, but it's of secondary importance to aerosol spread. And we know with most viruses with this little fatty envelope around them that these viruses have, that when you dry, you get a marked drop in the concentration of infectious virus. So yes, clean, but don't kid yourself that the really key issue is people mixing in real time, or even going into a room where someone's been within, say, 15 minutes or so and the aerosol is still there. We've seen very clear examples of how this works in quarantine hotels, as you're well aware. People who've stayed in their rooms just simply opened the doors and the aerosols have wafted from one room into the other.
Thank you. We do have another question, and I might just ask this one very quickly. Carlos Cacaro has asked, can you talk about the possibility of and typical speed of adjusting the vaccines to deal with the new variants? What is the typical time something like this might take?
Oh, I can address that. I know that Moderna and Pfizer are already developing booster vaccines for up and coming variants, and they believe they can develop these vaccines within 30 days. So that if they really need to develop a booster to combat a variant that may reduce the vaccine efficacy, they can do this very quickly in real time. And Tony, you may want to add to that as well.
Yeah, 41 days, I think Moderna did it, didn't they? Because
yeah.
It's just adjusting the sequence. AstraZeneca have done it as well. There are just a few concerns about a third dose of adenovirus type vaccines, whether you might actually get tolerance against the adenovirus portion of the vaccine. So current thinking in Australia, I know, is more towards using, say, either Pfizer, Moderna or Novavax if you've had AstraZeneca in the past. But we'll find out about that next year.
So yeah, so still getting 2 shots of AstraZeneca is important. It's really a booster shot after those 2 shots, whether that will be AstraZeneca or Pfizer, Moderna. Those studies are ongoing, and we will know that if and when it's time for a booster shot.
Thanks for clarifying, Sarah.
Okay, so how are the vaccines holding up against the Delta and Delta variant strains?
So the vaccines are extremely effective, as Tony has said. against severe disease and death. In fact, 0.003% of people who are vaccinated have died from the Delta strain. So they're extremely effective at preventing severe disease and death. But there have been people who have experienced mild and asymptomatic infection and being vaccinated. In fact, just a recent study from the New England Journal of Medicine found that 0.4% of healthcare workers who received 2 vaccinations from Pfizer had breakthrough infections. But they had both asymptomatic and mild disease. So the vaccines really protect you against severe disease and death. I think the way to think about it, Amanda, is we really have a choice. How do we develop protection against this virus? And one way to protect yourself is to be vaccinated, and that provides very large protection against severe disease. The other way is to become infected with the virus. But to be honest with you, being infected with the Delta variant can really lead to severe disease and death, as we're seeing in the ICUs filling up here in Australia.
Yeah, I think I'd already answered this, that nobody in our ICUs has actually, who's 56 people, none of those people are fully vaccinated. It is important to get the 2 doses. 1 dose will provide you with some protection, but less than against the previous strains. But there is still a risk of getting asymptomatic infection and mild disease even after immunization. We've learnt that now, and that's one of the reasons why in the USA, as Sarah will tell you, that mask wearing indoors is now recommended even for people who are immunized in areas where there's a lot of spread of the virus. So and that's what I was trying to say before, is that there's a hierarchy of protection, really terrific against severe disease and death, excellent against all disease, and less so against infection. So that's why we need to get everybody in the country immunized, so that collectively our immunity reduces the spread of this virus.
So there is a question here that relates to masks. So how effective are masks against aerosol particles?
So 95% with the professional N95 masks, and about 70% against the original strains, which was tested in battleships and things like this. Not absolute, and again, it's important to stay 1.5 meters away from people, and in essence, the surgical masks are far better than cloth masks. So you'd rate them. The N95 that are being used in hospitals are 95%, about 60 to 70% with surgical masks, and then less with cloth masks.
And studies using smoke and droplets have shown that they do really, even if there is some spray through a mask, it drops quicker to the ground than if you don't have a mask on. So it's really, really important to have that mask on and cover your nose. I see a lot of masks where it's not covering the nose. It must cover the nose, so that even if it's not absolutely 100% preventing droplets, it does cause them to fall quicker to the ground, so that 1.5 meter distance continues to protect you.
I've seen doctors and nurses not covering their nose, and I was in.
Oh, it drives me crazy.
The virus is growing at the back of the nose, and
Yeah.
so it only gets into the saliva as it drops down from the back of the nose into the saliva. So if you're not covering the nose, and then you're not going to be preventing those aerosols from getting out.
Absolutely. Wearing your mask as a chin warmer doesn't protect you.
We've got two questions here from Rachel. Sorry, they're jumping around a little bit. So what are the latest research learnings on the impacts of Delta on type 1 diabetes? and what are the impacts on children between 8 and 17 years of age?
Tony, I'll let you take that.
So I'll take the last one first. Delta is spreading most in the people aged 20 to 29, and they're the people that we're most worried about in terms of vaccine acceptance, because they still think they're invulnerable. And I remind people that we've had 20-year-olds in ICU. So, and we're also getting long COVID, which Sarah may want to say something about. So very important, and I think there's a lot of interest, and you may know that the 12 to 15-year-olds have now been, Pfizer's been licensed for 12 to 15-year-olds in Australia. So I think ultimately we're going to see above 12-year-olds being immunised, which I think is important. They're not quite as important in broadcasting the virus as the 20 to 29-year-olds, but they can get ill in adolescence. And also they do spread the virus, but there has to be some advantage to immunizing them alone. Diabetes predisposes to a slightly increased risk of COVID, particularly severe diabetes, but there's no evidence that Delta or any of the strains predispose to people getting diabetes themselves. But obviously, it's a form of mild immunocompromise, and therefore people with diabetes particularly should look at getting themselves immunized.
I would absolutely agree with Tony that someone with diabetes should definitely be vaccinated. The virus does take advantage of any decrease in our immune response.
Not surprisingly, there's been a couple of questions that have come through on AZ versus Pfizer vaccines. So we've got one from Peter, and I just might ask these two together. Can you explain the difference between AstraZeneca and Pfizer? And then one from Steve Atherton. He's saying he's got several 25 to 30-year-olds asking, should they get AstraZeneca or should they be waiting for Pfizer?
Well, I think I will start with the second question first. Okay. Right now, AstraZeneca has been made available to 18-year-olds and older in Australia. And I think I would have to just paraphrase Dr. Tony Fauci, who is an infectious disease expert from the United States, that the best vaccine that you have is the one that you can currently get. These vaccines are all effective against the Delta strain. And what you have to really weigh up is risk versus benefit ratio. So right now in Sydney, the risk is increasing. So we need to then have more people vaccinated so that they are protected. And Tony, do you want to follow up on that?
Yes, I heard John Skerritt from TGA emphasize this, the latest figures. And obviously what people are worried about is this TTS syndrome, thrombotic thrombocytopenic syndrome. And the figures on this are the risk of death around the world now is about 1 in a million. That's lightning strike. And people always think, oh, I might be that 1 in a million. But if you say that you have a 999,999 chance of not getting that side effect, it puts it into perspective. I cannot understand why people over the age of 60 who have a 2 to 3-fold increase in death rate and over 75-fold and over 80 20-fold, meaning if you're over 80, you've got a 15 to 20% chance of dying if you get COVID, and you're matching this up against 1 in a million. I just cannot understand why people would not protect themselves, and it's tragic to see the numbers of 70 and 80-year-olds are dying in our ICUs at present from Delta. So I think Sarah's absolutely right. I think people are now getting it. 85% of people want to be immunised in the Greater Sydney area because they are scared. The only problem is that it does take a few weeks for this to take effect, and I'm afraid we're all a bit late in getting ourselves immunised when the threat comes. So I find that We've got to be better at communicating the fact that the benefits so far outweigh the risks. They're incredibly important. Now, I want to address age because, again, John Skerritt in TGA, and this is fact-based, the differences in the risk of getting this syndrome under the age of 50 versus over the age of 50 are minor. Like it's about 1.5-fold difference. So it's a couple in 100,000, and it's a bit different below rather than above the age of 50. Those differences are just minor and should not preclude people from getting AstraZeneca if you're in your 20s or your 30s. And, you know, members of my family, just as the Premier has, just as the Chief Health Officer has, I've got scared people coming to me in their 20s and 30s, and I'm saying to my friends and relatives, please, please get immunized as quickly as you can and protect yourself against a virus that might end up with you in ICU.
Yeah, and I think really just that risk-benefit ratio. The vaccine will provide great benefits and protect you from severe disease and even death.
I think one of the big issues, and I'll slip one of my own questions in here, is and I saw your colleague Graham Stewart talking about this in the media recently, is around the AstraZeneca confidence. And we've got a few questions here about the blood clotting, and you know, I guess rightly so, because there has been so much in the media. And the messaging was so unclear. So how do we manage the confidence now around AstraZeneca, given we've kind of dug ourselves a little bit of a hole around that particular solution?
There's multiple ways that we can mitigate that concern and also that side effect. And one is, and Tony can talk to this as well, there is a test that can be done to see if you are predisposed to this side effect. And Tony, you can talk to that a bit more because you know the people who are conducting this test. So there are ways for your GP to say, okay, we can do this test to see if you're predisposed to this effect. And secondly, just being knowledgeable about what the side effect is and when you need to be concerned and when you need to go to your emergency room or to your GP and say, look, I'm having this side effect from the AstraZeneca vaccine. I think I need to be tested to see if I'm having the side effect. But Tony, I'll let you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. The side effects of these two vaccines, Pfizer and AstraZeneca, really occur in the first couple of days, the common ones, and they're pretty common. You know, people do feel pretty, many people feel really wrecked after the second dose of Pfizer and sometimes after the first dose of AstraZeneca, and that might frighten a few people with AstraZeneca, but they're just the normal side effects you get from any vaccine the first couple of days. So this syndrome, this clotting syndrome, and by the way, clotting is very common in our community. And if you've had ordinary clots in the legs, or even if it's moved to the lungs, that does not predispose you to this type of side effect, which is really an immune aberration. It's your antibodies that's in rare situations, people develop antibodies against their clotting cells. And in fact, this has been documented in other situations with the use, surprisingly, of heparin. So it's quite well known in blood clotting circles about what this syndrome is. The syndrome is being managed extremely well in Australia. The initial reports suggested high death rates of 25%, which in Australia are about 3%. And that's because we manage it very well. And that is that if you're one of those unlucky 2 in 100,000 people who experience this, then you need to be watching out for the symptoms of headache and an upsurge of symptoms between days 4 and 16 after the first dose of AstraZeneca. I should say the latest data seems to show that there is no risk with second dose of AstraZeneca. No one in Australia has had this syndrome after a second dose of AstraZeneca. So it's a first dose phenomenon, and in essence, if you get severe headache or ache in the tummy at days 4 to 16 after AstraZeneca, contact your doctor. He can actually arrange for the test to be run, and there have been a lot of people who've reported these symptoms, and only about a third of them have been shown to have the syndrome. And that's not unexpected, because everybody gets a headache and an ache in the tummy from time to time. So that's I think very reassuring that the syndrome is really well managed in Australia. And I emphasize again, it's incredibly rare. I scuba dive, and my risk of dying from scuba diving is 20 times greater than the risk from this side effect.
But Tony, there are tests that are available that can
yeah, that's what I said. Yeah. You go to your GP and he'll arrange for the test to be done.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the advice we should be giving to Philip Harmon, who has written a question here, an important question. My mother, grandfather, and a number of my mother's siblings died from stroke. Should I be worried about having the AZ?
No, that's not, as I said, ordinary clots, strokes, heart attacks, etc. are common. This is a very specific disease that is induced through an abnormal antibody response to the adenovirus part of the vaccine, the common cold carrier of the vaccine. It occurs rarely also with Johnson & Johnson vaccine overseas, more rarely than this. It only occurs with the first dose, and it is not predisposed to by any other form of clotting, which is much commoner in our community.
Look, not surprisingly, there are a lot of questions here about the different vaccines. So there's one here. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of mixing the vaccines? So specifically, if someone under 40 gets the AstraZeneca, then gets a booster of another vaccine type.
Oh, I can address that. So there have been studies both in the UK and Spain and other European countries that have had people who have been vaccinated with the AstraZeneca and then followed up with a Pfizer vaccine as their second dose, and they actually develop a higher antibody level. So it's actually not a bad thing to mix these vaccines. Now, currently in Australia, that's not approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, but it has been used in the United States and also the UK and other European countries. So starting with the AstraZeneca vaccine and then having your second shot as a Pfizer actually increases the antibody response to the virus.
And the reason
if I can add to that, TGA have not approved this because it hasn't been shown in terms of efficacy, and there hasn't been sufficient studies of safety. They're ongoing at present, and of course you wouldn't recommend this in Australia because we've got too little Pfizer, and the AstraZeneca effect in the field is as good as that of Pfizer in the UK. So why would you not take a second dose of AstraZeneca, which firstly has none of these side effects associated with it that we just discussed, and secondly, why would you deplete Pfizer at the expense of plentiful AstraZeneca in Australia? We'd be shooting ourselves in the foot for the moment.
And one thing I would follow up with is that study in the UK did show that if you had an AstraZeneca vaccine and then followed up with a Pfizer vaccine, you do have an increase in antibodies, but a lot of people had additional side effects. So a higher percentage of people had side effects from the booster vaccine from Pfizer. But I do know that these mixing of the vaccines has been taking place in the UK and also in some instances in the United States.
And that's because they got plentiful Pfizer, which we don't.
That's exactly right. But actually, in the United States, AstraZeneca is not approved for use. So it's a mixing of Johnson and Johnson and Pfizer.
And Canada has done the AstraZeneca Pfizer mix. But again, this is not standard practice. It's practice in some situations. Not yet. Probably will come.
So what you just mentioned that AstraZeneca hasn't been approved for use in the United States. Is that because they haven't gotten around to approving it?
I think it's because I think it's because they have a lot of access to Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. The Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson are all manufactured in the United States, and they had very high levels of those vaccines available. So they have not approved AstraZeneca because it's not currently needed there.
This question is an interesting one. Hopefully you're able to answer. Why can't we access more doses of the vaccine faster?
I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, interesting question, isn't it? Well, it's pretty clear to start off with. When Pfizer were approached about this, perhaps not really early on, but certainly I think midway through last year, their attention was completely diverted to Europe and the USA, which had huge epidemics, and the attitude was that Australia would have to stand in line. And that's the reason why we've had a slower rollout of Pfizer. And you may remember we had the same problem with AstraZeneca, with the EU, in fact, embargoing the 3 million doses of AstraZeneca we were meant to get. I think we should also recognize what a huge enterprise immunizing the world is. The most we ever did was in 2009, where we immunized 90 million people. We're now trying to immunize 6 billion people, and we're trying to immunize everyone in the USA, in Europe, where the vaccines were being produced. It certainly has given pause to Australia increasing its own capacity to immunize a greater variety of vaccines. And there are certainly pitches at present being made by all states to establish RNA vaccine manufacturing capacity in their states, not just for continuing COVID, but also for other processes as well.
60, as you say, it's a huge undertaking, and one that the world has mobilized, I think, pretty quickly for in the scheme of things.
I think I would like to add to Tony's comment, and that is, although we feel like we don't have enough access to vaccines here, we do have access to vaccines. There are still billions of people worldwide who don't have access to vaccines at all. And we really need to make vaccines available globally in order to get back to any sort of semblance of normal life, where we can travel internationally as much as we used to. So really, not only do we need vaccines available here in Australia and other, but we do need them available across the globe.
And I had a comment about how unlucky we've been in that the government originally pinned its hopes on 4 vaccines. The University of Queensland one, which was a very good candidate, but ran into problems with false positive HIV tests. The AstraZeneca one, where there's been this embargoing of 3 million doses and a huge fuss, somewhat overblown and with variable recommendations as data became available on TTS. And then we've got Pfizer and Novavax. And Novavax is a smaller company than some of the others, and so its timelines have been somewhat delayed. I suspect it's going to be a very good vaccine, and again, we will get that later this year. So it's easy to be very critical in hindsight, but as some of my colleagues have emphasized, we also have had some bad luck. And you have to also remember that when we started all this, RNA vaccines were completely unproved. They'd never been licensed, and so people were a little bit wary about how good they'd be, and even when their first results were announced, whether these were a skewed sample of an overall trial.
Now, we've got a little bit of a theme here around sort of mandating and making vaccines compulsory. So I guess there's a question around mandating vaccines and vaccinations in the workplace, but we also have a question here from Shane. I do not understand why vaccination is being pushed as compulsory, but for years the flu vaccine has not. In Australia, the number of deaths from flu is more than current COVID-19.
Can I start with that, Sarah? Do you mind on flu?
And I'll follow up, so you first.
Flu vaccine is in fact mandatory in hospitals. If you're caring for, particularly for aging people in hospitals, you can be a carrier of death if you actually have a flu vaccine. There's been a lot of talk about trying to get this also in nursing homes, and a number of my colleagues have been pushing this. But as you know, we've had difficulty even getting mandatory immunization of healthcare workers in aged care facilities, which quite frankly is criminal. To allow people to take a disease like COVID into aged care facilities before everybody is immunized is really, I think, beyond the pale. So as you're well aware, I'm sure there's a lot of discussion about immunization passports. This, in many ways, is a way to allow things to open up. You know, and I'm mindful of the comment this morning from the English Premier League, who really want to see crowds at their games actually backing Boris Johnson in doing vaccine passports. So I'm sure this will be a source of huge debate about individual freedoms. But one way to think about it is if you really want to get people back in close contact with each other and you don't want to see deaths, then it might be very wise to mandate compulsory immunization. It's been done in universities in the USA, as Sarah, I'm sure, will comment on. And it's also, I think France is looking at mandatory immunization passports as well.
Currently, all federal workers in the United States have to have a vaccine or a test, a weekly test. That's just been mandated in the United States. And then all municipal workers in New York City and Los Angeles, and actually all municipal workers across the state of California, it's mandatory to be vaccinated, or you have to have a weekly test. So it's really your choice. For me, it would be much easier to be vaccinated and not have to have a weekly test and a weekly swab put up your nose. So I think mandates are coming. I think that's going to be the future, and how that's handled by every country, we'll have to see. But I know that in the States, it's going to become more and more, that there's going to be more and more mandates. And they're actually encouraging small businesses to make it mandatory to be vaccinated before you can work in the workplace, or have a weekly test. And it's really up to the person working there. Do I get vaccinated, or do I have to go every week and get this test done?
It's interesting. A majority of the public in the UK actually see this. There has to be some advantage to being immunized. They may not play out across the whole political spectrum, but it is currently a majority in the UK public.
Yeah, and as Tony says, it will lead to our freedom. It will allow us to move around. I think there's one thing I would like to bring up about COVID-19 and the Delta strain. There is a ramification from getting infected with COVID-19, and that's what we call long COVID. And this is a condition where you have symptoms, long-term symptoms, weeks, months, and even up to a year after you have recovered from COVID-19 infection. And these symptoms can be such as a persistent cough, shortness of breath, fatigue, brain fog, depression, and even muscle weakness. So I really think it's better to be vaccinated and not be infected with this virus, because you can be saddled with this long COVID. The one thing we have to realize is that this virus can damage lung, heart, and brain tissue. So this can lead to long-term health problems. And that's where we're seeing this long COVID. And long COVID has been identified by the Centers for Disease Control in about 30% of people who have been infected with COVID-19. So it's not a rare phenomenon, and it's actually a very long-term debilitating phenomenon. So this virus can be extremely, extremely long-term for some people.
So the long COVID, do we know in terms of percentages of people infected with COVID, how many?
Yeah, so the US Centers for Disease Control say that about 30% of people who've been infected with COVID-19 experience some form of long COVID, whether it's days, weeks, or up to a year. There's a recent study of breakthrough infections in healthcare workers, and of the 0.4% who experienced a breakthrough, 19% of them, so 1 in 5, had some form of long COVID. So it's definitely a serious side effect and syndrome associated with this viral virus.
And the impact on the community and I guess the economy of that type of long COVID impact will be huge.
It would be huge. It'd be huge on businesses too. Yeah. You'd have people who would be ill, not being able to do their job.
There is a question here that is probably a little bit controversial, but probably important to address in terms of being transparent for those people that do feel uncomfortable about getting vaccinated. So there are some horror stories from the US that 30,000 have died from complications from the vaccine, and that legal action is pending. Is this fake news and a reason for vaccine skepticism? So that's from Victor. So I guess it's a matter of looking at it in context of all the information rather than just that. It would be interesting to hear from you.
Yeah, I think it is fake news.
Yeah, I've not heard.
I mean, they're getting Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson over there, and we know that the side effect profiles. And I can tell you more about the TGA profiles here, because we're looking at side effects. What happens in Australia, just to clarify this, is that doctors and patients are free to report to the TGA possible side effects of the vaccines, and then the TGA investigates every single case to verify whether this is feasible or not. And I think we need to also take notice of trial data. So you have placebos compared to people who receive vaccines, and you do the comparisons between serious adverse effects or not. And we do know that there are these very rare side effects of, for instance, with Pfizer and Moderna, of severe allergic reactions in the first half an hour. That's 2 to 3 million people per million people. And when I was immunized, I was watched for half an hour, because as a kid I had bee sting allergy. They watched me carefully and nothing happened. So we can manage that very, very easily, and our pharmacists can also handle these severe allergic reactions, which they've been able to do with flu. Sorry.
You're a man in demand. I'm not.
So I would like to follow up on that. I think if there's really these 30,000 side effects, we would have heard of this in the news or in the scientific community, and we've not heard anything about this. So I think, again, we have to be very careful what social media we listen to. There is a lot of misinformation out there about these vaccines, and we really have to be very careful. If you have a question like that, please do send us an email. We're happy to answer questions.
Well, that's it's wonderful of you to suggest that. We have so many questions here. I don't know which one to get to first. So there definitely is a lot of, I guess, a lot of need out there, a lot of demand for more information, particularly around the vaccines. Obviously, that's been that's our way out of this. It's obvious, but you know, we need to get to a point where everybody feels comfortable that it's the right thing for them to do. So I think I've got time for one quick question before we go. So is this from Trevor Oldfield? Is there an idea in terms of percentage of likelihood that someone fully vaccinated may then become infected and infect others?
Yes. So
Trevor.
yeah, so this is a good question. There are very rare cases where people are infected, whether when they're vaccinated. There are breakthrough infections that does happen. For example, there was these healthcare workers, 1,500 healthcare workers were followed, and 0.4% of them had a breakthrough infection. So yes, you can be infected, but it's a very low percentage of people who become infected. But yes, they can then, once they're infected, pass the virus on. And that's why right now the director of the Center for Disease Control in the United States is requiring people who are, or requesting the people who are vaccinated to still wear masks inside in areas where there's high levels of infection in the United States, because people who are vaccinated can become infected, and they usually experience either asymptomatic or mild disease, but then they can also spread that infection to others. And Tony, do you have something to add to that?
Just to add to that, we heard, and this may be particularly more so in aging people, we know their immune system is not as good. And we know that 4 people from the Summit Care facility were admitted to Westmead. They had asymptomatic infection. You get asymptomatic or mild infection. I repeat again, 56 people in ICU in Australia, just in Sydney, despite over 2,000 cases of Delta-caused COVID, 56 people in ICU are unvaccinated or had one early after 1 dose. So 2 doses of vaccine protects you, but it doesn't stop you from getting asymptomatic infection. Whether it reduces the amount of virus you shed is still to be clearly defined. But as Sarah said, there is sufficient concern about the possibility of such asymptomatically infected people passing the virus on to others that in the USA they're recommending the use of masks indoors.
The director of the Center for Disease Control in the United States says she has seen data that has shown that those who are vaccinated and have asymptomatic infection can actually shed some virus. Whether the level is as high as those who are not protected by vaccination, we don't know yet, and we'll have to see the data.
There's a recent study, which she hasn't quoted, I've seen it just recently, which shows a slight reduction. That's why I'm saying it still needs to be carefully defined how much that occurs. But I think there is evidence of some ongoing spread, and that's the reason for the use of masks.
Absolutely.
Can I just say one thing? I think everybody in the Westmead Institute has been immunised, bar a few. Sarah and her family have been immunised. My whole family has been immunised, including my son, who's in his 30s, and his partner. And we do know that the Chief Health Officer has been immunised, and her family, with AstraZeneca, and the same is true of the Premier. That's a lot of very knowledgeable people who know a lot about this, who've looked at all the data and thought, my gosh, I'm going to protect myself, my family, and my community by being immunised.
I think we have gone a little over time. There are so many questions here, so I will just. This one does seem important. So, can you please say the name of the test that can be done to reassure suitability for the AstraZeneca vaccine for those with pre-existing conditions who are in doubt?
Now, you don't get the test as you don't go and have the test to see whether you ought to have the AstraZeneca vaccine. Let me make that very clear. It's only in people who get symptoms that, and as I said, it's 4 to 16 days after the first dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine. If you get a severe headache, a severe bellyache, high fever, etc., then you need to go and see your GP, who will arrange for you to get this special antibody test, which is directed protected against clotting cells. It's not a prophylactic test. You will not have, people pre-immunization won't have that antibody.
Yeah, sorry, I misspoke on that. I meant after you've been vaccinated.
I might suggest that those people that do have questions, if you wouldn't mind emailing them through, we will leave a, we'll pop an email address into the thank you letter. And if there are burning questions that you would really like answered, I'm sure we could accommodate that for you, but we have run out of time. So absolute honour to have you both here with us today to share your knowledge, to have two people that are at the forefront of this and really understanding all of the research and all the information that's out there, and is able to distill it for us in the way that you have. So really, very, appreciate that. So thank you so much, Sarah and to Tony. Thank you also to those that have joined us online today for today's session. If you're interested in knowing more about how you can support the great work that they're doing at the Westmead Institute of Medical Research, please get in touch and we'll provide the information in the thank you letter for you to do that. We strongly encourage you to get involved and support the incredible work that people like Tony and Sarah and their teams do. So for further information on any upcoming events that we have, WSBC has, please visit our website, wsbc.org.au, and there is a short poll that will pop up on your screen as we close. So please, it would be great if you could just take a minute just to complete that. Thank you again, Tony, and to Sarah.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of your day. I'm off to get back.
Thank you. Everyone else too. Bye.